My name is Fred Witzig, and the topic of this roundtable is Teaching the Midwest. I intend to make some short introductions to the panelists, then introduce the topic of the panel and why we thought it might be useful to take on this topic, and then begin the questions. I have a list of questions here that I'm going to ask the panelists, and they will respond in turn. However, we really hope that their responses generate conversation. They have not, as far as I know, they've not prepared any sort of lengthy presentation. Feel free to begin speaking with anything you want to say, but then we'll move right into questions. So I'm pleased to introduce them this afternoon, as someone whose last name begins with a W. I like to go through lists in reverse alphabetical order. So first is Dr. Matthew Vossmeyer. Am I pronouncing that right?
That's correct.
All right. Professor of History at Hanover College in Southern Indiana, a private liberal arts college. And I have to mention this, he got his PhD from that wonderful school in Bloomington, Indiana, Indiana University. He's published quite a bit in the history of antebellum politics and culture. And he's also served as president and held a number of other offices for the Indiana Association of Historians. Next is Dr. Matthew Daly, who traveled here all the way from across the street.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, okay. He's an associate professor of history here at Grand Valley, where he just won the Outstanding Educator Award from the Grand Valley State University Alumni Association. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
You've also won a teaching award from the Pew Faculty Teaching and Learning Center here. So I noticed that. No, pretty neat. He also serves as a consultant and curator for several public history institutions in Michigan and Wisconsin, and has published a number of pieces on Midwestern history, particularly in the history of the Great Lakes and shipping, if I'm reading your CV correctly. Yeah. All right. Then finally, our third panelist is Dr. Bruce Bigelow from Butler University in Indianapolis, Indiana. He has published extensively in Midwestern history, especially in Civil War politics. And he's actually a geographer, a historical geographer, and I told him I had a historical geography class as an undergrad towards the end of my education. And I thought, oh, it's too late to go into geography as well. I had a blast in that class. My name is Fred Witzig. I'm an associate professor of history at Monmouth College, which is also a small liberal arts college in rural western Illinois. And I've been there for 8 years. Previous to that, I taught for about 8 years at Franklin College, among other places, and also came from Indiana University in Bloomington. I'm actually a native of Los Angeles, where I lived for the first 30 years of my life. And my research specialty is actually the colonial South and religious history. But I've taught Midwest history, either as Indiana in the Midwest or Illinois in the Midwest, for probably 10 years. I sort of picked it up at Franklin College, and then it was on the job posting when I went to Monmouth College. It was part of that. Nobody else wanted to teach it, so I did it. And I've come to really enjoy it. But I've taught it much the same way for these past 10 years. And that brings me to the topic and genesis of this panel. I've really enjoyed teaching the Midwest. The class that I've taught is one of my favorite to teach, particularly since I take advantage of the fact that it is local history. And so the course is project-based, and at least 2 of the students' projects are to visit a historical site and do an oral history paper interviewing somebody from the Midwest. So in both these cases, they get students out of the classroom to meet the sites and the actors that actually participated in the history that we're talking about. But I'm on sabbatical next year, so I started thinking early this year about how I might spend at least some of my time revamping my Midwest history course. I've noticed that I've always taught it as the history of the United States writ regional. So here's the prehistoric era of North America, and here's the prehistoric era in the Midwest. And here's European settlement in North America, and here's European settlement in the Midwest. And then came the American Revolution, and here's how the American Revolution happened in the Midwest. So the Midwest comes down as having no real story of its own. And indeed, if there's an overarching narrative that emerges in my course, it's that Midwest history is really the cutting edge of American history. If it happened in the United States, it happened here first, or most. And I tell you about, the War of 1812 was really a Midwestern sort of thing, and the lead up to slavery, well, let's talk about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And did you know that the 1860 candidates for the presidency, the main ones came, including the victorious one, came from Illinois? And industrialization, well, you should see Chicago in the late 1800s. I was getting really dissatisfied with this narrative, particularly since sometimes it really is a stretch to make it work. And I think students recognize that, which I think is good. But what do I replace it with? What other narratives are available? And equally important, what materials can I use to create those narratives? So sort of last minute, I threw in a proposal to the organizers of this conference, and they took the bait. Surprisingly, really surprisingly actually, I discovered that there are many Midwestern colleges and universities that don't teach Midwestern history, or even their own state history. I compiled a list of potential panelists, and it took a really long time. And so I'm curious why it is that so many colleges are reluctant to teach the history of the Midwest. If I had the time, I would turn this into a research project to come up with some good statistics about how many schools and how many instructors actually teach the Midwest. And then I would compare it to our peers in the South or New England or the West. My hunch, and it's completely, entirely a hunch, is that other regions do a better job of teaching their own history than the Midwest does. My own undergraduate alma mater, Cal State University, Los Angeles, taught a California history class and a Los Angeles history class, and then I also took a California geography class as part of my training. At any rate, I'm very pleased to have found these professors here. We have a professor from a state university, a professor from a private university, and counting me, 2 liberal arts professors. We have representation from Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois. The 3 other panelists have extensive research and teaching experience in the Midwest, and I look forward to their responses. So here's the plan. I'm going to read off the questions in brief summary so that you know kind of what is coming up. In case there's something you want to ask or you want to input, maybe it's more appropriate for a later question, whatever, so you kind of know what's coming up. Then I'm going to go back to question number 1. I'm going to ask the panelists for their response, and then we're going to ask for audience participation. Once we've sort of maxed out that question, then we'll move on to question number 2 and kind of make our way through. With that, the questions that we're going to ask involve, number 1, is the history of the Midwest merely the history of the United States writ regional? Or is there a way to teach the Midwest without following the typical thematic narrative of the nation? Native America, colonization, independence, early republic, antebellum reform, etc., etc., etc. Other regions have, question number 2, other regions have themes that govern or anchor their histories, for better or for worse. Do we have any themes that can govern or anchor the histories of the Midwest that we tell? Number 3, are there other narratives and themes useful to teach? If there are other narratives and themes useful to teaching the history of the Midwest, what events, people, and places do you use to teach those narratives and themes? And especially I'm interested in ones that are distinctive to the Midwest. Number 4, how might the teacher integrate the distinctive geography and topography of the Midwest in the syllabus? Number 5, what might the teacher think about the balance between state and regional history? And I'm curious how many of us in this room teach a course that is titled History of State and the Midwest. And if you do that sort of thing, what is your balance between teaching the state and the Midwest as a region? Number 6, I think we're on, is it healthy to ask the above questions? Or will it lend itself to provincialism? Number 7, how might teaching Midwest history intersect with teaching public history? I have a strong interest in public history. How might historical sites lend themselves to teaching the Midwest? And the last one, whatever the answers to the previous questions, what resources, primary and secondary, are available for creating a dynamic course syllabus? Is there a textbook to use? Use fictional literature such as novels or films for teaching the Midwest? Is there a canon of Midwest historiography? If not, should there be? That sort of question. We're talking about sources at the very end. So, all of that, back to question number 1. I'll ask the panelists this, then again you can join in when they're done. Is the history of the Midwest merely the history of the U.S. regional, or is there a way to teach the Midwest without following the typical thematic narrative of the nation? And I just want to throw another thing that is not in your question. I sent these questions to them beforehand. This could very well...
Our unfulfilled potential, right? And so eventually we get to talk about things like that. the sort of the blossoming of the Midwest in the early 20th century and Rust Belt and so forth, so we can play with those ideas.
Right.
Yeah. What's the vision for
Yeah. Yep. Do you want to?
Sure. I have a bunch of answers, but I think one I would sort of talk about is you ask a little. I jumped down to like question 4, so it's geography and topography of Midwest and sort of natural realities. I mean, especially for like the Great Lakes. I mean, that's a massive component to that. That sort of the interconnection is not just of this massive body of water, which you can really track the entire time, which goes from being cultural significance, the early Native Americans. You can read accounts of that, and I have them do a great deal of those primary sources to say what are they encountering. And French explorers will come in. Brulé comes in and goes, well, we found China. And then we got to Lake Huron. Clearly we didn't find China. And then we found Lake Superior and we turned around because that was too big. And that really gives a sense of how you're changing conceptualizations of space, of place. And tied to that too, when you think about themes, I use a great deal of discussions of how those relate to technology, right? I think oftentimes we relate to the concept of creation of, for example, the Reaper, right? We talk about the Great Plains. Actually, we talk about North and South Dakota because they had to ship it out the Great Lakes because the railroad couldn't do it. But the Reaper is not just technology. The older versions of it is continuous autonomous progress, right? Every day and every week we're getting better and better. Well, rubbish. The only reason you can sell the McCormick Reaper is if you have enough space to make it work. And reading the advertisements, reading the letters back and forth, which are now increasingly available, how they're marketed at the newspapers, that sort of to find out letters going, if only we had a technology we could do this, we could see how they're coming to this. And I also spend a lot of time incorporating both geography, technology, and concepts of land, to where if you go to there's Susan Gray's book, Yankee West from Michigan. I used a chapter of it, and there's a series of letters that were published in Michigan history when it was an academic journal that were sort of transcriptions in the 1950s. And it's about several women who are early settlers. It's not from the man's point of view, it's from women's, and the students will read one that from Carolyn Kirkland, the novel, Our New Home in the West. It's a sour vision of settling in the 1830s. They get to a place, but it's written, the students have a hard time understanding that it's a satire. But when they read this section, they have to wrestle. Is this straight history? Is this a satire? It's written in language, it's like Charles Dickens, right? They're like, is she really being funny or not? We use historic maps to go, when she gets to Pinckney, she goes, well, it's that Pinckney's just north of Ann Arbor. Wait, this is a fiasco. But then tied to Gray's work, when they get to Kalamazoo, they're like, yes, we're spoiling the whole thing. Little time, wait, why are we chopping land in little small spots? We can grow more stuff, and then there's technology that comes in. And to conceptualize, I always tell students it's not the most exciting reading, but it also means for a transformation using technology, engaging this landscape that's completely different, efforts to try to draw more people, because there's another letter that they write back to their home defense in Connecticut to say, come west of Far, Michigan, don't worry, at least she lists out all of her household goods. And the class will go, no, she's bragging. And I'm like, what is she saying? She's not broke. Oh, even think about it. Oh. And so it's fun to see them wrestle that to where the one family says, we bought a Reaper and it has made all the difference. We don't grow everything. Welcome to the market economy, right? But instead of it being programmatic, it takes us about 2 weeks to get through the material. But then we can jump it forward to say, well, why is Henry Ford in Detroit? Well, he's not he hit his mind and it leaped from his brain. It's, you put it together, having places in a certain spot, seeing how agency and contingency can play into that. And so that's how I see a lot of those things. And that's only by the geography of the plains, the necessity of the Great Lakes, right? How do we get ships, these big ships around? Well, we have to do this and that, a new way of looking at things.
Yeah.
And so.
Bruce, do you want to add to the geography? Kind of thing, how you use geography or topography?
I spent the first 2 months talking about physical geography.
Yeah.
No, yeah, I do the physical geographical base right up front of the entire Midwest. And then, so that's sort of the stage in which this history is going to take place. But, being a geographer is sort of natural for me to do it.
Do you bring it back in? Do you bring it in like as smaller pieces if it's...
Yeah, sure.
Okay, good. Yeah, because I do the same thing, because otherwise you go, it doesn't make sense. So we could go, well, look at, we do the thing of Michigan, and I'm like, but if you think about it, there's the M46 line, and then they go, oh, there's no farming. No, we didn't think about that. And that's a way for them. And with the historic soil surveys that are now digitized, I want them to look at that, to be able to look at plat maps. I use a lot of primary sources that are digitized, and I have found that's been almost the most revolutionary part for me, to where it puts them to where they're able to work with that and really dig down to go, okay, how does that work? How does it shape it? And that's, having them read plat maps has been ridiculously fun. They get very angry, and then they suddenly realize that this is the story of where these families go. And I had them do that with Susan Gray, because they read the first time, they went, this is incredibly dull. But once they look at the map and go, oh, the Barretts are buying up half the county. And there you go. Now it opens up, and then the discussion is really quite engaging from something that seems really simple. I tell them, if you like capitalism, you should know about it. Right?
Anybody in the audience want to jump in right here?
I teach at it's an Indiana University campus in Columbus, Indiana, 1,500 students, about half of whom are adults. Very, very few history majors at any one time. And in fact, our history majors have to go to Indianapolis to IUPUI to complete the history degree, which is an odd situation. Therefore, when I teach what Indiana University has now decided to call Hoosier Nation, that's the title of the course.
Hoosier Nation.
Hoosier Nation. I didn't. You know, this is one of the things about being part of a big statewide university, is that sometimes they change things and they don't consult you, and they don't give a if they do, if you don't like it. Most of my students, about half of my students at I teach the class probably every 2 to 3 years. About half of them are going to be adults. Almost all of them are going to not be history majors or social science education majors. We, for some reason, have totally divorced our elementary education program from taking all that many courses in the liberal arts at our campus. I've made that face. So, you know, I don't get like would-be teachers or anything. It's mostly just random people who have to take so many upper-level classes. It's the one upper-level history class, it's maybe the one history class they're ever going to take in college. Because we also in Indiana have now removed history from the required curriculum for in-state universities. So, you know, I do a lot of what we all just said, you know, the Indians and the French and different peoples, and it's not like you think, and you know, people from New England and people from the Upland South and the Civil War and all of that stuff. And I get to the 20th century and I start to, you know, usually the first day you ask, you know, what do you think of when you think of Indiana, what do you think of when you think of the Midwest? My students are 98% white. My students are from small towns and rural areas. Many of my students, hell, they've never been to Chicago. A lot of my students have never literally been to Indianapolis, which is 40 miles away from the campus. You know, and on the other hand, we have students who have been all over the world, often in the military. You know, I start talking about, you do know that there's been a Hispanic population in Indiana for over 100 years. No, they didn't know that. Migrant workers and then settling the factories of East Chicago and Hammond and so forth. You know, we talk about the great migrations of African Americans, which of course we can link fairly quickly to basketball and Oscar Robertson and Crispus Attucks and these things which, if you're from Indiana, are iconic parts of the state's history. And it's an opportunity for me, to get them to think a little bit historically about, you know, things happened before they were born. But it also introduces them to parts of even just the life of their own state that many of them have never encountered or known about or thought about or whatever. And, you know, you were talking about they've removed Michigan history from upper levels of high school or whatever. You know, last time any of my students took Indiana history was in the 4th grade.
Do you use James Madison Hoosiers as your textbook?
First time I taught the course, I volunteered to teach the course because I desperately wanted to keep the job. And I thought that might be a way to do it and work with the education people and stuff like that, ha ha ha. But, and you know, what I knew about Indiana history, you could put in I mean, I was teaching it in a summer term. I was teaching it on Monday and Wednesdays. And on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I was going to historic sites around the state to learn as much of the history of the state as I could in the summer, whatever summer that was. I became very dissatisfied with Madison's textbook, but I continued to assign it. The new version is obviously 10 times better. You know, I mean, it was dated. The first version was dated the day it came out, and whenever that was, the 1980s, and you know, concentrated way too much on the 19th century and the frontier. If you know,
just to comment on something that you mentioned there about your demographic of your student body and so forth. When I taught Indiana in the Midwest in Franklin, at Franklin College, or actually anywhere I mentioned Indiana history, and I mentioned race, I used this really great article by Sacchino, Andrew, I think his name is Sacchino, about the KKK in Noblesville, Indiana. Noblesville today is a very, very 99% white.
right.
They found some old KKK records and they didn't know what to do about it. And had a big discussion about it and so forth. Well, it's a really fantastic article on a number of different levels. But when I had my Indiana students read it, it was like electric in the room.
Mm-hmm.
They were incredibly sensitive to Indiana's racist history. Incredibly sensitive. And they had a lot of personal anecdotes to talk about. You know, I had one student say, you know, my uncle is still in the KK, my cousin's still in the KK, and they just did this last weekend. I mean, they're intensely aware of it. So I get the same article now for 8 years in my Illinois class, and the conversation is totally different. And I had one group of students do a project on civil rights in Illinois. And their response was, this was really fun. I didn't know there was any civil rights issues in Illinois. I mean, just that geographic, that political border between Indiana and Illinois made a huge difference in
Well, I had students who come from Greensburg, Indiana, which nobody else here has ever heard of except maybe Bruce, which was the site in 1903 or 1904 of one of the first ethnic cleansings in the North in the 20th century, you know, long before the Springfield race riot or, you know, Tulsa or any of the rest of them. It was like 1902, 1903, 1904, whatever the date is. And, you know, there exists about 3 pages of literature on it. And, you know, and yet I've been told that a lot of the land records, if you go to the courthouse, a lot of land records in the city, there's a break in the titles. They're owned by somebody, and then about 1904, that somebody falls out, and suddenly about 1910, somebody else ends up owning the land or the house or whatever, and there's no connection made on the records.
I think I have a question for you. So for Hoosier Nation, is that like a class in a box? Does it come prescriptively?
No, thank God, no.
Okay, well, and that's sometimes, you know, I taught for, just to speak to your experience, Grand Valley is also, it's more diverse than it was, but for 20,000 students.
That's causing issues in our local community. We are getting more visibly diverse.
And that's something that even here I deal with, and I've taught in Metro Detroit. You would think that sort of like Metro Detroit would be all about sort of discussing Detroit history, and no, it's a wacky vision that comes through, and so I, in some ways, chucked the idea of having that sort of prescriptive narrative, and increasingly sort of said, well, what's my audience?
Yeah.
And it's your point, like you said, you know, there's land records and it breaks. I will confess, when I initially started doing that, I thought, boy, this is a real pain. It's a lot of work to get the records because it's not there. I just was having a great lunchtime conversation, which I missed the plenary, to talk to Michigan State University's press's representative to say, how about a collection of primary sources, right? We haven't had done one of those bad boys in 40 years, and it was all sort of 19th century, but to really recognize what Michigan is. I mean, this is a very, and the Midwest, which is all sort of, you know, Wisconsin's all jammed on one side, Michigan's jammed on one side. and to pick up perhaps thematically something that would really sort of grab your students to that sense, right? To say, how does this, and maybe horrifyingly enough, it doesn't look like what a lot of us think a class is. But I taught a lot of non-traditional students at Ford Motor Company. And it was a very diverse class, and it was one of the great teaching experiences because I was able to work through a lot of material with them that it didn't look like it was. It was the Midwest, but to say, look, this is the Odyssey, it spreads out, it decentralizes, and to use those primary sources to help them see that those transformations, images and so forth, and clustered around ideas. And that touched on stuff, and that might be something to grab your students a bit more. I mean, I agree with you on state history textbooks. They're either Texas and California, which is fine, it's the market, or they're written for a particular kind of audience, and I think that's...
Well, I think part of the reason I probably did it was the original version of Hoosiers that Madison wrote. You know, you basically get to the Civil War, and you know, you're about 2, 3/4, 7/8 of the way through the book, and then you have after the Civil War in the 20th century, and you know, it's about 6 pages or so, it seems. I mean, am I exaggerating that much, Bruce? I'm sure you...
I won't answer.
Okay. I mean, you know, I love Jim and all that, but and I do, but.
And that's something else to think about too, is that, you know, for Michigan, for the Great Lakes, for a lot of resources that are around regionally, National Archives branch in Chicago, there are an increasingly large number of digital materials you can utilize.
Yeah.
And if you've got the ability, I found it, you know, sort of useful where I asked I taught at a community college and asked them if they use the technology, and I think I'd fallen from Mars. They said, "Oh, nobody asked that." Sure. And that was a way to sort of open the door to where for my Michigan class, and I've done it for the Midwest, is to select areas. So for my class, for example, for Michigan, we look at particular counties, and not just the urban ones, but to say, how do these things reflect back? And that's been also very interesting because you can see how communities respond to these sort of external pressures. Do they even know what the pressure is, for crying out loud? You know, on the top level, we can say, yes, there's the panic of 1893. I always think of the book Wisconsin Death Trip, which is a collection of images and newspaper articles. And a lot of times we look at, oh, it's so sort of lame, but it's the dark side of sort of settlement in the small town. And I found that to be interesting. They talk about, you know, hobos and outsiders and things in the community. It punctures the national mythos, and it punctures a lot of, at least for me, state ideas that everything was great until X. And same for Detroit, if we look at a lot of the increasing mapping and demographics are available for the city, it becomes clear that something really went on in the city, and it wasn't always just one way or another, that there are certain things that come in, and it's, for students who are not even on board with that, I find it pushes them in a different direction. And I think it plays out in other places too.
Sir, do you have a question?
Well, I was just going to say, you need to go, since you're interested in the Michigan history or the history, local history, you need to hear his presentation, this last one that's coming, because you're going to be talking on that agriculture stuff, and you're going to be, I bet, Ottawa County.
Mm-hmm.
And he came to, I'm on a board of a historical society and on the board of the local museum. It's all one thing. And we had him come to Zealand and do a presentation, and it was probably one of the best we've had. And he talks about in Ottawa County, I'm not going to steal your thunder, but the board that handled agricultural issues during the 30s didn't get money. The government didn't give them money, but they took over. And there could have been a disaster in Ottawa County, and they averted it.
And it's a way to look at, and a lot of that stuff comes from what just was mentioning. It was just those sort of land records. You wonder, how does this play out? And I played around with my students on that, and that's what led it forward to even be able to do that.
He's got his students digitalizing the records.
Yeah, and that's something that can really be done.
I got it on the file for you.
Oh, good. So anyway,
Yeah, a question. I can't remember who mentioned the KKK article in Indiana. Things like that where I guess the students could relate to it because they had caught whispers of that in their own families. But a question for all of you would be, are there any strategies or tricks that you might play on your students so that they get to see Midwestern history as something strange and unique? Because I would suspect, if my own opinions are any forecast of this, is that a lot of students would say, oh, there's no culture in the Midwest. It's just blah. You know, it's kind of the gold standard for it. That's why TV anchors want to have a Midwestern accent, because it's seen as no accent. Are there any things that you do in your classroom to make students say, oh my gosh, I never realized that a lot of the people in the Midwest do this, or they believe X, and ways to surprise your students when you teach Midwestern history?
Start listing people with a Midwest connection or Ohio connection. You know, musicians from the Mid, you know, and if you're in the plenary session, you know, musicians from Michigan, you know, or the Midwest, whatever it was, or you know, authors or TV stars, or you know, I mean, you know, once you start digging, you can come up with, you know, these are people or things that are symbolic of America or some cultural, you know, I mean, you know, start with what they know and work out from that. Yeah, you know, because they may know about rock music, but you know, they may or may not know about Sister Rosetta Tharpe or something like that. Yeah.
Or like you've got
or Aretha Franklin.
Or
I also, sorry to talk so much, but
Letterman.
I would
from Indiana.
I would too say that you know, part of it is to sort of gauge not just expectations, but to think about so much of local history oftentimes is sort of this determinist, right? It's going to happen, it's going to go there. And it sometimes is worthwhile to think about, I play around with in different areas and why certain industries go away sooner than you might think, right? Why that vanishes. And from Michigan to the upper Midwest, I look at lumber, right? And settlement patterns and how those decisions go forward. And it's not what you think, right? You go, this area's always looked like, well, wrong, it's not. A question for lumbering I always ask students is, when we're reading these materials, did anybody know, for example, that they may in like 1870 think, you know, pretty soon the trees are going to be gone. And that really opens a door for a lot of the sources to really wild discussions, right? Because they go, wait, we thought it was going to, they knew it was going, why did they do it? And then to think about for the upper Midwest, Wisconsin, especially for Minnesota, for Michigan, for chunks of Ontario, is when those resources are gone, what's next? And you watch them spin people off, to your point, in even more recent times, that sometimes those convulsions can do that, but also the sort of efforts to try to do those things. And that can be, at least for me, my students have told me that subverts their idea that every day in every way, we're getting better and better to go, right? Yeah, that didn't work at all, and you go, oh, or I use sometimes for when I teach in Grand Rapids, I use this for other cities, and I use Google Earth a lot for this because I can't take them to Indianapolis, but to go and say, well, what are these buildings you drive by? What's this furniture? Okay, where'd that go? All right, that's a problem. How do you go forward? And that kicks them in a different direction, or to think about how do different, a neighborhood in Grand Rapids has been the traditional immigration neighborhood, and how it rotates through, and the layers of community are there. I mean, Grand Rapids to the south was initially Dutch, then it was African American for decades, then it was Latino, now it's become much more diverse again, it's gentrifying. And walking through those layers of that demographics, the community entities, that opened a door to think about change across time. Just one little space, but that can be blown up to whole regions and how that alters.
Okay, well, why don't we just jump into the last one here, the last question about resources available. We sort of mentioned textbook a little bit, fictional literature, novels, films, Is there a canon of Midwest historiography? If not, should there be? If so, what works does it include? What archives are most helpful? What online databases, primary sources published in print? What should we be subscribing to or buying? What belongs in every school library, available to all students? Let's just have some great ideas, maybe not a lot of description of each one, but just to throw a bunch of items out, thinking of things that might be useful.
Yeah, exactly.
Just throw them out there.
Where do you want to start?
Yeah, great. I mean, we've heard quite a few already, but just keep going.
Oh, me? Oh, gosh. Yeah, well, let's start with, you want to start with novels? You want to start?
Sure.
Yeah. The ones that I use, I've used in class, I think could be surprising. Lewis's Main Street, Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio, film picture of the 1920s, or perspectives on the perception of Midwestern identity. I could imagine using excerpts from Eggleston's Hoosier Schoolmaster, or Parkington's Magnificent Ambersons, St. Clair's The Jungle, Sister Carrie, Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby. That's just things that's off my head.
I also love Fitzgerald's short stories, because he writes so much about, especially Minneapolis, the sort of aspirations of small town, which is a lot of fun to do that. I use some 19th century novels for different areas, because those are oftentimes very good, like Carolyn Kirkland for Michigan, looking at that settlement. Other than the Great Plains, it's almost like I've also used a little bit of like Little House on the Prairie, right? Big Woods. I've used Upton Sinclair's The Flivver King to look at the rise of the auto industry and so forth. I've looked also at a number of, I use a lot of Reinhold Niebuhr, Leaves in the Notebook of a Tamed Cynic. He writes very harshly, I mean, especially for my very religiously oriented students, it really grabs them, because he really goes after capitalism and goes, what is our role in Detroit? And that's a question you see. He mentions other folks around the Midwest asking that question. That's a lot of what I draw on, and it draws that in. I also use a good bit, I use Malcolm X, who talks about his life in Lansing and so forth. He talks about streetcars. I also use a good bit of material from Clarence Darrow. There's also a series of collections. I would also recommend looking at state history presses. A lot of them actually have really terrific, increasing numbers of document collections and literature that comes out in reprints that are actually quite affordable. And I find that to be really engaging. And I would also say look for if you're looking at urban centers, for like Grand Rapids, for years the African American community was ignored, it's only Latinos. And now we've suddenly had two terrific books come out, one by Randall Jelks and another by Todd Robinson. And then one was African Americans for French City, the other is City Within a City. And Detroit, of course, is in most major cities too, but a lot of smaller communities like Yankee West by Susan Gray. There's a growing number of those. And even, I use Bruce Catton's Waiting for the Morning Train, about sort of small town sort of reminiscence. And I think a lot of states have that, and that students really got into that sort of piece because it was something different. I also use Annalisa Cox's A Stronger Kinship, which looks at an integrated community in southwestern Michigan. And she asked a great question: are there more of these places to where Michigan had black codes until the 1870s? And then surprisingly, now she's come up with more materials on the oral histories from the families. So that's really made it. So I think a lot of places have that sort of stuff available, and also colleges and university archives. I found writing to them and asking them for looking for some sources. Most archives and libraries have a ready reference file, and they will be thrilled to send you that stuff if you're looking for different aspects. So I used to be a university archivist, so I can tell you, if you ask me to send you stuff on what was going on in our area, I can send you lots of stuff.
I use novels too, and also even film. Particularly, I've used Going All the Way by Dan Wakefield, 1997 movie, where Ben Affleck, that was his first major movie, Rachel Weisz, and also Rose McGowan. It's about how conservative Indianapolis was in the 1950s. It's set in 1954. How conservative religiously and politically it was, and it's about two young men coming back from the Korean War, one played by Ben Affleck, and how they decide at the end of the movie to move to New York City. They don't want to stay in Indiana. I've also used The Magnificent Ambersons, which is a novel by Booth Tarkington, but the movie was 1939, Orson Welles, famous movie by Orson Welles, Magnificent Ambersons, about the change of the elites in Indianapolis in the 1890s, 1900, as the automobile industry hit Indianapolis, and this new elite of auto industry execs take over from the older elite and the problems you have there. In terms of novels, I use My Antonina about the frontier Nebraska, the settlement by Czechs, and interrelations between Czechs, Germans, old stock Anglo-Americans, and other groups. I already mentioned Enemy Women about the Scots-Irish Ozark woman during the Civil War. 1,000 Acres by Jane Smiley about problems on the farm in Iowa, including women's issues, obviously. Winesburg, Ohio, which was mentioned. Life in a small town in around 1900 in northwest Ohio. Clyde, Ohio is Sherwood Anderson's hometown. And I use that novel, and there's all these strange characters in this small town. So they're not all alike at all. And they all have all these hang-ups or problems. And so you get a rather negative view of small town life in Ohio around 1900. In fact, I remember one student told me, who was from a small town in Indiana, near the Ohio border, that there were no weirdos like that in my home. So, anyway, Coast of Chicago, it's about the transformation of the near south side of Chicago because of urban renewal under the Dailies, and how that affected the population that was living there, which was mainly a mixture of Mexican Americans and Polish Americans, and how that whole area just flattened. And now it's gentrified, and former Mayor Daley actually has a condo there. Hoosier Schoolmaster, like, that's the clash between Yankee and Southern culture in Indiana in the 19th century. And Sister Carrie, about the problems of young women moving to Chicago, how they're going to adjust by themselves. And she becomes a kept woman, and Dries' novel wasn't allowed to be published for about a decade before it finally was allowed to be published. So those are the things I use.
I would also throw even, it's kind of fun, students for West Michigan, especially like Road to Perdition, ties some of that sort of material in, and this sort of, it really catches the look of what that is. I also use Fist, right? Sylvester Stallone, Blue Collar, one of my favorite sort of labor movies, where it has Richard Pryor, Harvey Keitel. Try to really draw that in. I would also recommend too, looking at state libraries. Oftentimes they will have a series of, especially in their library catalogs, a lot of older books from Michigan. There were a series of African American community groups that produced statewide histories of African Americans, especially in small towns, and they were all primary sources. People wrote the letters and they had their materials, and it was really exciting to see that Ohio did that as well. To our the Ohio Historical Society, I want to say the 1920s went through and did a series of these sort of studies of Quaker farming communities that were sort of established. And I found that to be really exciting, because then that led me to county history societies, and I could write them and they'd gather. Again, it's a lot of work, but if you drill down through it over time, you can get quite a bit of stuff to where you think about that, to where you can find a host of ethnic communities really within that sort of piece, and also any sort of state anniversary celebrations, right? So if you get statehood, you'll find out, whatever it's like the 150 years, 75 years, something like that, they will always produce something, and as you go through the 19th and 20th century, especially as it gets closer, you'll find more of those materials pop up in things that you wouldn't expect, which I found to be interesting, and also state government documents. That was also a lot of materials, especially, I find the students, I would never discount, and this sounds incredibly boring, states loved to put out records in the late 19th, early 20th century. And for Michigan, and I know for Wisconsin, there was a series of Bureau of Labor studies, and they all did this. But it was every worker, job, payment, housing condition, and they covered everybody. It was an informal census, and it was startling because suddenly, as my friend Randall Jux pointed out for Grand Rapids, they said, well, we knew something, but we found this incredible layer of various communities, women working. In addition to the First World War, there were a series of studies, you may find other ones, women were asked to participate and to volunteer for Grand Rapids, for Flint, for other cities. They produced these, what they call women's volunteer cards, and they're really thick and they're across the state. And so you suddenly got a window into that. So there's a lot of those resources, and really go after state libraries, the State Historical Society. Many times those folks actually have education departments who really want to work with you and can be quite excited for that. It's worthwhile. If you're going to go to the state sites, I also recommend grabbing any of the documentaries that they may put out. Anybody that has a film, for example, in the Upper Peninsula, outside Marquette is the state monument for the iron ore industry, and their initial film that you go in and watch is really well done. It's very good, and it certainly is a great entrepot. We talk about public history to say, do they do a good job? Who's in, who's out? We push it around. We look at the African American Historical Museum and say, how do they tell that story? What's in, what's out? And we've increasingly had a lot of students from Chicago and Detroit. That's really fun, because suddenly they start talking, our students go, we didn't know this, how do we engage it? And then also too, many state historical societies will put out in the late 19th century a lot of materials and binders of letters and so forth. And they oftentimes have the sort of traditional themes, but others will have like a special set aside, and you have to sort of sort through that narrative, but it opens up to other communities as well. And so I would really push to really try to mine those resources which are there and are really available, and also to write to county libraries, because most small libraries like Zeeland and so forth have their own history room, and you might be surprised at what people kept. We can assume, well, they wouldn't care about that. I know a book, I forget the name, that is on Marion, Indiana's The Prison and the Lynching. The level of stuff, I don't know if you've ever read that, if you ever look at the bibliographies, yeah.
What is it? Which book?
Lynching in the Heartland by James Madison.
If you look at a lot of that sort of material, where they got a lot of that from is it was in common knowledge. It's just buried, and everybody knows it. I can tell you that for Grand Rapids, we had a massive Klan rally in 1925. Everybody knew it, but even at 180,000 people, no one wrote about it.
That's one way you can get into what people know and the electric history of race in South Central Indiana. And then you can point out, look, there's even points in the book where he obviously knows more than he's telling.
Sure.
I mean, he knows who the perpetrators were. It's very clear. And if anybody doesn't name them.
And if you have a link to, say, like America's historical newspapers, if you play around with some of those things, and I like to have my students do it across the state, especially for the Great Lakes, and then I also got them a listing for Ontario and Canada to look into it. You can ask those questions for the newspapers, and then that requires you to do all the things, sort through it, analyze it, what's in. Students said, well, what do we know about lynching? We went into that sort of piece for Michigan, and they were really jarred by the level of detail, the discussion, how race was discussed, even something as mild as gender roles, such as women riding bicycles in small towns. Oh, that fired off a whole set of discussions about the issues of modernity. And one of the things in one of my classes, we did a big class project for the Klan in Michigan, we found that once you got away from the major cities, race wasn't the issue. It was external pop culture. It was changes in attire. And for us, it sounds sort of like, yeah, we know that. Our students don't. And that sure fired them in a new direction. And I think I would recommend that too, as those resources are.
For Indiana, you can use Middletown.
Absolutely, yeah, Middletown.
I need to jump in because we're out of time. I'm supposed to keep everybody on time. And you have a panel coming up, right?
Yes, I do.
Okay. 10 minutes. Yeah, okay. So, really quickly, we reserve the honor of the last word here. I would like actually to, I'm not sure exactly how we will logistically do this, but I would love to collect syllabi from all of you. Not only the one you're using right now, but if you have a previous version that you still like, but you've moved on. And then I don't know if you all email me, and I'll send the three, I'll send them to you, to all of you, or if you want to email all of them, I guess you can do that too. I'm just thinking if there's a way of centralized distribution.
You're willing to be the centralizer?
Yeah, so if the three of you could send me electronic copies of your syllabi, any syllabi you want to send me, and then you can just send me, F. Witzig at Monmouth College, F. Witzig. The second thing is that I want to do is make a plug for an undergraduate research journal. It's called the Midwest Journal of Undergraduate Research, MJUR. We're actually a national journal, multidisciplinary, and just strictly undergraduate. It's undergraduate peer reviewed and faculty reviewed. We actually, we're very proud of the feedback we give for authors who aren't accepted. We give extensive feedback. We try to make it a really educational sort of thing in that way too. It's an annual issue, it's print and online, and we'd love to have more Midwest history. I'd love to have more Midwest history. So I'm gonna, if I can be so bold as to give you call for papers and encourage your undergrads. We have about a 15 to 20% acceptance rate. It's fairly selective. We want kind of major projects submitted, but again, if it isn't accepted, we give really good feedback. So thank you very much to the three of you for helping me out. I learned a lot, and I have a lot of great ideas. So thank you much.
Thank you.